Yeah, we're doing well. We're getting to the end of summer. It feels like it slips through my fingers every year. I don't know.
I
It's
know.
just, it's
I
crazy.
know. I know. I know. Tempus fugit nocte venit, as they say.
Yes. Well, if you have any tips for making it stop, I'm open to it. I'm open
I'm
to them.
sorry, Jen. There's only one way to make it stop, and I don't want to hear about it.
That's true. Hmm.
Let's see here. Make sure all my ducks are in. Oh, you're not doing it. Very funny that way. There you go. Good. Okay. All right. So you are on a bit of a tight schedule today, yes?
A little bit, yes. The children can't hold themselves back anymore.
Oh, I know. Children are that way.
They are.
We're good. It's okay. We can finish by 1 o'clock. So first, a bit of business news. I'm going to be working at Trinity School, and that would be
Are
starting next
you?
week. Yeah, that'll be starting next week. It's a volunteer thing. I'm basically just teaching a
Okay.
class pro bono, and I'll be doing that like one class for every day. It'll be in the afternoon, but we'll have to recalibrate when we're meeting
Sure.
based on that, and also based on children's schedules, because I'm sure you're going to be engaged into the school thing as well very soon.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
have you started yet with your own faculty meetings?
Not yet. That comes next week and the week after.
Yeah, okay,
So,
okay.
yeah, yeah,
So maybe after we're finished here, we can just do texts back and forth to figure out what we want to do for this program as we move forward to during the course of the school year. Sound legit?
yeah. That sounds great, and I'd love to hear more about your class that you're doing. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, no, it's basically just a Latin class, I just
Okay.
jumped right back into it doing Latin.
Wow.
So, let's see here. For anybody who is going to be joining us suddenly out of the blue, we are trying to do this. Tick, 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 tick. There it is. Right? We are looking at John Taylor Gatto's Underground History of American Education, Volume 1. I don't Did he put out a
Mhm.
volume 2?
I don't know. I actually haven't dug into that yet.
It says an intimate investigation into the prison of modern schooling. That kind of skews the narrative a bit, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
They're
um,
fighting words.
they are indeed. But I was thinking of texts that we could do after this. I was thinking of And Madly Teach, which I'm actually going to make reference to today. It might be a fun one. And the other fun one, which maybe we could talk about, is the possibility of doing the Introduction to the Liberal Arts by Clark and Gine, which I think is a very good one to read. Um, uh,
Yes.
did you ever read Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture?
I've started that one and I have not finished it yet.
Okay, that's another possibility. Maybe we could check
Hmm.
that out or talk about that. So three possibilities, right? Good things we could look into next once we get through Gatto. I'm going to call up the text and see if I can't share that instead. This is, let's see, stop share here. This is the text of Gatto. And last time we were talking about, I think we had begun to touch on his ideas about the Hindu schooling. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, we did. I was gonna ask for a quick backtrack, and I think when I glance at my notes, I see we talked about the liberal arts, and you gave us a really good background on that.
Oh, that
And
was
then
fun.
we were just getting up to this bit about the Hindu schooling.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of what we're talking about too is focused towards the Catholic school system in America as well. That
Mm.
the Catholic school system emerged primarily out of that, what was it called? The parish school system, or the bishop schools as they were called, I think.
Mhm.
So there's that too. I think we had touched on that originally. I don't remember how much we got into that. Um, but where did he talk about that? He gets into Oriental pedagogy. Um, yeah, so we talked about the seven liberal arts, right? The trivium
Mhm.
and the quadrivium. We talked about the cathedral school system that was set up, which was the Christian Catholic school system where it was paid for by the bishops in order to train young monks, especially. And that's kind of where we went with the Catholic school system in America, but then I think America also realized, hey, we've got a lot of immigrants we have to teach, and so they set up a alternate school system to the public school system in America. And then we talked about something of the actual scholastic debate, what that was about. And then we got into, he began to bring up this idea of the Platonic ideal,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the whole guardian class that he brings up. And I
Mm.
don't remember if we ever really got into that at all last time. So
We
maybe
didn't.
backtrack on this. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would love to talk about that.
Well, let's start there. It's a good place to start. I mean, you recall at least having read Plato, I'm sure. I don't know how much
Mhm.
of Plato you remember necessarily, but so I won't quiz you on that and put you on the spot.
Thank you.
Uh, But Plato brought up this idea first, and there was always this discussion between Plato and Aristotle that was ongoing. We see that in
Mm.
the painting of the Renaissance painting of the School of Athens. Plato was always dealing with the cerebral, metaphysical world of ideals and forms, and trying to figure out how those forms invested themselves in the physical world. And Aristotle was always looking at the physical world and seeing how the physical world could be extrapolated from to get these ideas of the metaphysical. So there's an ongoing debate between the two. You know, Aristotle was always this way. I mean, Plato was always this way. Aristotle was always this way, and you see that in the School of Athens when you look at that painting. But he brings up this idea of the potential guardian class. See, he says educational offerings from the church, that says the cathedral schools, were intended for, though not completely limited to, those young whose parentage qualified them as a potential guardian class. Okay. So what he's talking about here is that Plato proposes in the Republic a three-tiered system to building the polis, to building the city, the Republic. There's the thinkers, philosopher, kings that lead the place. Then next there are the guardians that defend the place, and then the bulk of the population, which are the workers, kind of drive the place along. You know, they are the ones that just do their lives at it, daily trade and arts and that sort of thing. So the city can't survive, Plato says, without these three classes. And the one that was being trained most was the guardian class that then from that guardian class some of them would progress into the philosopher king class that would rule the city. And what he's suggesting here is that most of the church, which was based on Platonic forms and ideals for many, many years, had created the schooling system that was trying to create an elite based on merit. I think it's called a timocracy. I think meritocracy. We would, if we just want to use the word. The guardian class would be those people capable of defending the society that we had. And so everything they did was in order to uh, improve the lives of those who could be guardians and to weed out those who really didn't have the potential for being guardians. And I don't know if I necessarily see that as a entirely bad thing, in the sense that there are some people who have the potential and interest for doing
Mhm.
cerebral labor, politics, philosophy, that kind of stuff. And there's some people who have the potential and or desire to have nothing to do with that. They don't want any of that stuff. They want to learn crafts, they want to learn music, they want to learn um, sport, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. If, for instance, we had an ideal world, you would have people who I think said, I'm good at what I do, and what I do is gardening, you know, or I'm good at what I do, and what I do is working with wood. And you'd be satisfied that in an ideal world. So in some
Mhm.
ways, this early church system that grew up in Europe, which is what this cathedral system was, kind of fed into that. And I think that they were always training the we call them elite, always training the intellectual class to be guardians, whereas training the people that had a craft in an apprenticeship normally. And if you prove to be good as a woodworker or as a stonemason, you go into an apprenticeship where you learn that specifically. So anyway, there's that. He goes on to talk about this Platonic ideal, and he says that France at the hands of a philosophical cultist known to history as philosophes, enthusiastic promoters of the bizarre idea of mass forced schooling. Most prominent among them, a self-willed man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The French kind of took this thing and they ran with it, saying that their schooling system was designed in order to create the elite class. And for them, the elite class was not just the guardians of civilization. They were the nobles and the wealthy and the powerful. And Gatto has a thing against that, obviously. And one of the guys that really, I'd like to think of him, I follow Bloom's description of him as a leech upon society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote this book, Emile, about education. And that book is, I don't know, it's tedious, boring, but it is instructional as to how they were thinking about education at the time. Because at the time, the educational system was sort of like you'd have a perfect mentor who would oversee a single individual, single pupil. Normally, it was expected to be a noble son, right? Somebody of the noble class. And he would know exactly what to do in order to guide that student this way or that way. So, but he wouldn't give formal schooling. It was like if the student showed interest in flowers, you would guide that student to understand more about the taxonomy of flowers and herb lore and horticulture and all this. It's kind of like a Montessori school with an omniscient teacher in a way, and only one student. Okay, so
Mm.
strange way of thinking about things, but definitely influenced that idea that the French had, which was, yes, we are the perfection of humanity. We are the best on the face of the
Mm.
planet, you know. Um, and that kind of carried over to a certain degree to America. I mean, you see like Thomas Jefferson admiring the heck out of that school system and admiring the heck out of that type of education.
Mm.
And Jefferson, for all his greatness, was to a certain degree, I think, an elitist. He thought that there should be an elite
Mhm.
class in America.
Mhm.
Obviously, Gatto is very much against that. So, so then, okay, yeah, and I put down what is a Volvox, right? Um, Collectivizing ordinary humanity into a colonial organism like a Volvox. What is that? So I looked that up and got a little click on the Volvox. Um, let's see if I can do that and share that. I don't know. It is basically it's a type of chlorophyte green algae is what it is. Chlorophyte green algae. So it's kind of
Oh,
funny to bring that
yeah.
up. Yeah. So of course this was only one of many colors to emerge with a new nation. It was not the most important an inference that can be drawn from the fact that the pyramid was kept from public notice until 1935. And I was kind of startled by this. I don't really quite know what he's going on here until I looked and I said, yes, the Great Seal. He's referring to the Great Seal. The penetration of this idea, at least on the periphery of our own founder's consciousness, is captured in the powerful mystery image of the pyramid on the obverse of our Great Seal. Um, he's talking about the whole Enlightenment project that Rousseau was part of, that knowledge would filter down from the very elites to the average people. Like knowledge would come from heaven to the elites and then down. And this was embodied in the image of the Great Seal that's on the back of the $1 bill. And the $1 bill, if you haven't looked at it, I mean, if anybody uses paper money still, it has a pyramid, and at the top is an all-seeing eye at the very top of the pyramid, which completes the pyramid. And all the knowledge comes from the all-seeing eye down to the unwashed masses at the base. And what Gatto is pointing out here is that this, first off, wasn't adopted as a symbol until 1935, which I was kind of surprised about. I did not know this until I read Gatto. I looked it up, and sure enough, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the fun boys that were part of his progressive movement administration, they all said, "Hey, that's great. That's a great idea. Let's ask the Catholics." I think I mentioned this. Let's ask the Catholics if they'll object to this Masonic symbol on the back of the bill. And of course, they asked the Bishop of New York, and he said, "Fine." So, that's the way that goes. But I think it's important what he's bringing up here is that this is a very old concept. Maybe not an old symbol. It's a very young symbol, 1935, but it's a very old concept. the concept being that there are some of us who are the best and brightest and most brilliant, and they should be the ones leading society, and they need to have an education worthy of their greatness and the luminous glory that comes from them. And then they
Mm.
will pass down to the unwashed masses the information they need in order to survive. So if you're looking at a history here, Gatto, he's being selective, of course. There's a great deal more to these images, I think, than he at first lets on. But if we wanted to look at it, the history of it, Plato and his ideas, which descend from heaven to earth in that structure, the philosopher king, the guardian, the workers, his idea is an elitist idea for an elitist
Mm.
society. And it does filter down to the French idea, which is an elitist society. And then it filters down to the progressives of the 1880s, 90s, and turn of the century, which was an elitist idea. They even said all departments should be governed by um, an aristocracy of experts, I think was the term they used, aristocracy of experts. I think Gatto is onto something here in that his gorge rises at that philosophy. Maybe being told by the experts all the time
Mm.
how we should think and what we should do is not the best way to do things. And I think that to be rebellious against it is appropriate. I mean, I've read Plato so much now and I've studied him for so long. I don't think that he was I think his interpretation of him as trying to actually institute a real structure for society, I think that's a misread of Plato. But that's for another day. We can talk about that another day. I think he's doing something different than that. But that's
Mm.
basically what he's talking about here with this pyramid thing. And so he's railing against this idea. And he says, given this perennial idea, a lot of the early educators in England and America started looking for models that would be useful to create an education for cementing this ideology of the top down. I think that's called is it inductive reasoning, I think, or is it deductive? It's inductive reasoning, I think. Whereas
Mm.
Aristotle's deductive, I think that's right. Deductive is, does that sound at all familiar to you, or am I fishing
It
here?
does, and I can never keep the two straight. I'm sorry. Can't
I
help you with that one.
Okay, I think deductive is where you look at all the facts. You know, you've got the knife in the ballroom, Mrs. Peacock,
Mm.
and therefore you put it all together and she must be the murderer. I think that's deductive reasoning, which is what
Mm.
Aristotle does. And then inductive reasoning is the spirits have told me that Mrs. Peacock has done this, so therefore the
Mm.
knife in the bedroom fit into it, you know. And
Mm.
um, the inductive reasoning is a little bit more dangerous when we start to question where does, say, Plato get this idea of the forms and the greatness of heaven? Where on earth does that come from? Start
Mhm.
picking it apart, you know. And especially when you try to apply it, because yeah, it doesn't really work so well when you try to actually apply his concepts for government or for education. So,
Mhm.
okay. So he goes on a little bit further and it talks about Oriental pedagogy. Now, I got to admit, this whole section kind of surprised me because I never really had thought of it this way, and I'd never known anything. So I'm a little bit out of my water depth
Mhm.
here.
Mhm.
Um, but that's why we're doing this, right? We're
Yes.
finding this out. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, he talks about the Jacobin orators of the French National Convention, early 1790s. They were all about leveling Oriental pedagogy, as it says. You could also say that the Jacobins were proto-communists, right? That they
Um,
wanted to
mm.
make everybody equal and give to those who need from those who have abundance. I was reading, I was listening to Dr. Lindsay, Dr. James Lindsay, talk about whether or not socialism started in the 1840s, where normally we put it Karl Marx. Turns out, no, Karl Marx is actually buying into something that was prior to himself. There's a fellow, and I'll just share this really quick as a side note. There's a fellow, a French fellow, who is named Morelli, I think. Right? Yeah. Morelli. This is Morelli, the code of nature or the true spirit of laws. And what is this? I forget what his first name is. But essentially, what Morelli suggests is that, yeah, property is the root of all evil, and we have to do away with property, and we have to share everything communally. And those who don't like it, they should be killed. That's essentially what he
Mm.
says. It's really quite
Wow.
amazing that this is back in before the revolution or during the revolution, I think, even in the midst of it. It's quite stunning. 1755. There
Mhm.
we go. 75. So before the revolution, here he is, and he's writing the same time as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So
Wow.
what Gatto is saying is that the the characters in the French Revolution were trying to level this aristocracy vision of education. And yeah, I
Mm.
think they were. I don't know
Mhm.
entirely if that's a good thing necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, but they do seem to have been doing so.
Mm.
So, and then he makes a statement here, which I thought was very profound. Utopian schooling is never about learning in the traditional sense. It's about the transformation of human nature. The core of the difference between Occident and Orient lies in the power relationship between privileged and ordinary and in respective outlooks on human nature. In the West, a metaphorical table is spread by society. The student decides how much to eat. In the East, the teacher makes that decision. Okay. That's kind of powerful stuff, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
Utopian schooling, and by the way, it's U, not AU. In Greek, AU, EU means good,
Mm.
place, topos. Utopia, just a U, means no place. So Thomas More wrote about no place, not good place, being consciously ironic.
Mm.
But part of what Gatto is getting at is that utopian schooling, which is the ideal schooling or schooling for the good place to come. Utopian schooling is never about learning. It's about transformation of human nature. Sounds right, right?
Mm. Yeah. Into
Um,
what? What are they transforming it into? That's my question.
that's a good question.
Mm.
I mean, if, for instance, if you're dealing with the cathedral schools, I think that they were trying to transform it into the guardians. You
Mm.
transform a young man or woman, a young man, into from a wimpy, self-serving, kind of selfish guy. You transform him into a powerful, dynamic, ready to do what's necessary to save the city guardian.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, you transform human nature from being self-serving and unaware of its surroundings to willing to give down up its life for its friend.
Mm.
You could be transforming, like Clark and Giant in their great discussion of the classical education. They talk about how the transformation that occurs is a transformation towards piety, to um,
Mm.
to value the things of society that need to be valued.
Mhm.
And certainly, if we go back even to the ancient world, there was no education system in the ancient world, but the education book was the Iliad and the Odyssey together. And in the Iliad, the transformation that occurs is the transformation of Achilles, blubber boy. That's what his name means, right? Akos means tears or crying or weeping. So Achilles is little tears. The transformation of little tears from blubbering at his mother's feet because somebody has insulted him to transforming him into being somebody who participates in the human experience and is part of humanity. He grows up essentially. And what does it
Mm.
take in order to do that? So that transformation of human nature to something greater or something better has long time been in the Western mindset, I think.
Mm.
Probably in the Eastern mindset too. The question arises, is that really possible to do that? Or is that even a good thing? Do we transform human nature? Can
Yeah.
human nature change? Can it alter? Um, I think that to a great degree, we can change aspects of human nature. I think that we can help the transformation of human nature, which is not our work. In other words, the work is done by some other entity,
Yeah.
God. you know. Um, and we participate in it. And for even people like Plato's character Socrates, Socrates said, "I'm just a midwife. I'm just helping the other
Mm,
person give
mhm,
birth to himself." You know, he participated in the education, but he wasn't the sage on the hill giving the other person all the knowledge.
mm,
Um, that's Western culture. And Gatto is pointing out that in the East, uh, the the sage on the hill is the model. So the West, you say, okay, here's all this stuff, and I will govern you to be able to choose what's right and what's not. And you will grow, you'll transform because of that. In the East, the teacher's like, do this, do that, and transformation will occur because you follow my orders.
mhm,
So much so that frequently, like if you take this in the samurai culture, the culture of Bushido, samurais could frequently tell who your master was by what technique you used.
mm,
So you were part of this school, you were part of that school. And same thing with even the philosophical schools of the East. If you were following this guy, you would profess this and be able to do that. And if you're following this guy, you would profess this and do that. It wasn't somebody who was seeing all the different possibilities and choosing what was best. It was that you were part of this school and therefore you did this. And as you, I think there's even a phrase in Eastern, like the something like the fame of the student is the glory of the master. You know,
mm,
the
mhm,
student gives glory to the master because he's famous because the master trained him that way, right? Whereas
mm,
in the West, it's like the glory of the student sometimes is independent of the master, strangely. So
mm,
I had a teacher once, a mentor once, who described education as this banquet that you spread before students,
yeah,
which I thought was a fun metaphor. But he never followed up with the idea that we as teachers counsel them what to eat and not to eat. We don't. He didn't say
mhm,
that, and I think that's a large portion of it. You know, you lay out the banquet, you say, "Oh, here's everything from the crazy notions, for instance, of Candide, you know,
mm,
all the way to or the crazy notions of Karl Marx, all the way to the solid notions of Adam Smith or the solid notions of Plato or whatever it is. And maybe some of this, but mostly that, you know. I think that's what teacher does is sort of guides a student to be able to handle
mm,
certain things and maybe not delve into some other areas so much.
yeah,
All right, so there's that. I'm just moving through the text here because I think it's important to go through what he's actually talking about.
mm,
Um, he does make this statement. It was easy to ignore Plato's gloomy forecast that, however attractive utopia appears in imagination, human nature will not live easily with the degree of synthetic constraint that it requires.
mm,
Yeah, that's interesting. Human nature
mhm,
would not live easily with the degree of synthetic constraint it requires. Yeah, Plato tried to teach this Prince of Syracuse, I think. I don't know if you know this story.
no,
Okay, he was actually, you know, because he was a real guy and he had to make money. So he was actually hired by the king of Syracuse to train his young son in philosophy. And he really gave it his all. I mean, he spent like, I think, a year almost trying to teach this kid.
mm,
And it all fell on deaf ears. He couldn't change this kid's nature at all. The kid was constantly refusing to do what he had to do. And ultimately he betrayed all of Plato's ideals and sort of turned on him. And so Plato returned to Athens and he wrote in one of his letters about how he had come to the conclusion that not everybody was teachable. You know? And
oh,
so that's why you even he said that's why you speak in hidden images is because some people just are never going to get it. So
interesting,
yeah,
yeah,
Christ even brings that up where he says, "I speak to you in parables." I speak to
mm,
the people in
mhm,
parables because they don't, you know, they don't understand the way you understand. And to those that have, more will be given, but to those that don't have, even what they have will be taken away, which sounds cruel on the part of the Lord, but it's
does.
kind of a reality of life.
You know, that's interesting because I've heard a lot of people attribute to Plato that if you just know the truth, then you do the truth,
Oh yeah.
right? And you will do the
Oh yeah.
truth.
Yeah.
But that doesn't sound like that's actually Plato at all.
Mm. It's a sort of a accretion from Plato by the Neoplatonists. What
Hmm.
Plato did say was that anybody who does bad actions,
Mhm.
this is before, by the way, just to set the stage, this is
Mhm.
before the concept of sin actually came on the horizon. Sin was an
Okay.
idea that actually was developed in Jewish culture, strangely enough,
Interesting.
and it leaks down into Christianity because the Greek educated Jews were the ones who kind of mingled these two ways of looking at the world and created this new thing. So
Mhm.
sin ends up being an error against the rules and laws of the created world, which is essentially against the rules and laws of God, right?
Mhm.
But it is a mistake that you can make expiation for. You know, you can do something to fix it. And of course, there are temporal as well as eternal effects. So you have to suffer the temporal effects. You know, if you jump off a cliff, your legs are still broken, even if you didn't mean to jump off the cliff. Um, and then you have the mortal and the venial sin. So venial sin has a certain set of things you can do to fix the situation, and mortal sin you could mortal sin is really bad. I mean, it really could damage you, and then almost it can kill your soul. That's why it's called mortal sin. You can fix it to a certain degree, but the rest has to be done by God. So anyway, that whole concept of sin was developed because the Greek educated Jews mingled these two schools. But the Greeks, if we take Plato to be the paragon of the Greeks said that error or bad action was not sin. It wasn't evil in the sense that we think of it. It was um, mistakes because you didn't know the full truth. If you
Mhm.
knew the full truth, you would be compelled by the beauty of that truth to not do horrible actions. And
Mhm.
that's in Republic again. And that's why at the end of the Republic, he has what's called the myth of which is where the character sees all these different souls in the afterlife. And some of them are thrown into Tartarus and just ground up because they've done so much bad stuff during their life they've never learned, and there's no way of
Mhm.
saving them. But then the majority of people who have made mistakes then get to choose a new life. They can choose either to be reincarnated in the world, or they can choose to go on to bliss, the Elysian fields. And they only choose to go on to the Elysian fields if they can see clearly, if they can determine the good clearly. If they can't, they go and choose different types of lives, and those lives are different according to miserable to happy, and
Mhm.
you choose a life based on what you are capable of seeing. So when you get reincarnated, your job is to try to discover what the truth actually is, so that on the next go around you have another chance to possibly fix it, choose the right
Mhm.
kind of life, maybe even choose the Elysian fields and not do things so bad that you go thrown into Tartarus. So his whole premise, and by the way, that's all a metaphor, if you will. That's all part of the myth of at the end. So it's not like
Mhm.
doctrine for him. But what he's doing there is, I think he is taking what otherwise was this condemnatory vision of human life. That is, if you do X, you're sunk. You know, in fact, to be honest, everybody's sunk because they all go down to Hades no matter what, according to people like Homer, right?
Mhm.
Even Achilles and the others just go down to Hades and it's just miserable. For Plato, there's kind of a
Mhm.
revolutionary thing going on where he's suggesting that there might be mercy from the gods, um, that mercy might allow you to choose, but it's based upon your knowledge. So if you know something, you can choose better. And the more you know, the better you choose. So really I think what's happening with Plato is that Plato is trying to construct a system, if you will, a system of education that liberates the soul from all the things that would obstruct its ability to choose well. And in that sense, I think the Platonic works, the majority of them, the Platonic works are more of a religious attempt to create mythology, to create
Mhm.
a mythological system that would act as a religious device in order to free souls from the inevitable darkness of Tartarus that otherwise they would fall into. I find it quite merciful to be honest, and especially if you see it in a light of a pre-Christian world. It's a very merciful system. That then gets translated into Christian realm of the
Mhm.
emerging idea of purgatory. Purgatory, of course, is not a thing prior to Christianity. It's not on. It's, the concept of purgatory was not revealed. We'll put it that way. And during Christianity, it begins to take shape that maybe there's this possibility of choosing right, purging your sins, making your way to heaven, so that by the time we get to Dante, who's the first great, really articulator of purgatory, um, you've got this whole system worked out of levels of a mountain and all these different punishments that would be appropriate to the people to work out their sins in fear and trembling, as Kierkegaard says in the 19th century.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's an interesting progression of this idea of purgatory versus Hades versus heaven. But the thing to go back to is that in the West, that afterlife, that eternal bliss, is a thing that can be attained. And it can be attained primarily by knowledge and action, both.
Mhm. Mhm.
So education becomes eventually this not just something I think for cementing a culture, the caste system. It becomes a possibility to liberate every soul from the darkness of its possible damnation. Does that
Mhm.
does that kind of make sense what I'm articulating here? Okay.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. It's a very powerful vision that motivates a great many people even today in terms of becoming teachers, wanting to teach, because I don't think that, I mean, there are teachers that go into it for odd reasons. Nobody goes into it for the money, by the way. Um, but I think the majority of people that go into it because they think I'm helping young people to be liberated. I'm
Mhm.
helping young people to have a better future. I'm helping young people to achieve salvation, things like that,
Mhm.
which is a very noble vision, I think. It goes all the way back to Plato, and it goes all the way back to those early cathedral schools that were forming those guardians. So,
Mhm.
to some degree, I think Gatto might be skewing the evidence a little bit, in that I don't know whether or not the building up of an elite was the motivating force for the Platonic, the Aristotelian, and then later the cathedral schools. I don't know if that is the
Mhm.
motivating force.
Mhm.
I do think that was very quickly latched onto by certain people. Say, "Oh, we could use that," you know.
Yeah.
But even there, those that did so would get teachers like Plato, who then say, "The Prince of Syracuse cannot be educated." So, what do you do with that? It's a very good book to read on this. Rodney Stark, I think, does a very good job of talking about
Mhm.
this in his book. He talks about the discovery of God, or discovering God, I think is the name of the book. And he goes through a sort of anthropological study of how this concept of the divine developed over time. And he's quite good on this subject. So I would recommend him. But let me go back to this point, if I will. I'm sorry, I'm burning daylight here. Uh, one of the things I think that is important to note is that in the East, this whole idea about education being attached to salvation and education being a freely chosen thing doesn't seem to exist. Now, I'm not an expert on Eastern thought, so I can't really say definitively. And if somebody is an expert on Eastern thought, I welcome the schooling. See what I did there? But I think that the Eastern schools primarily were they were generally voluntary. It's true because you don't like you would have to seek out a guru or a master or whatever it is. But they almost always relied on the idea that all this knowledge was coming down from the guru to the student, rather than the student being liberated by knowledge that they acquired volitionally. That's kind of a problem because the two cultures do clash with one another. And they especially clash if we would value this strange concept that we call democracy, which Gatto seems to definitely push. By democracy, we mean that we have the ability to choose how we govern ourselves. not democracy like our democracy, right? As some individuals will say in America currently. Um, so this idea of utopia, the perfect world, the beautiful world in the future, is a possibility, but Plato has a somewhat gloomy forecast about it. Either we have to force utopia by making this caste system where everybody kind of fits in there, or else it is something which is not possible because you're going to have people you can't teach. You have people that defy the whole thing. It doesn't take. I'm reminded of that great passage where it just says that seed falls on rocky ground and fertile, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Bible confirms this idea that Christ himself, the incarnation of God himself, says, um, you can't teach everybody. You know, two men are standing in a field, one's taken, one remains. You know, the one that remains is sort of like, I don't know, the kid who never applied himself in school. I don't know. And the one that's taken is that's the A+ student. So there is even in the Bible, there's that intimation that it's not, it's difficult, it's messy, it's not easy
Sure.
to do this. So I do know that in Eastern schools, they did a lot of thwacking. uh, when you're meditating, or when in Eastern schools, when you're meditating, or when you're trying to contemplate the words of the sage, if you happen to fall asleep, for instance, they'd hit you,
Oh
beat you over the
no.
head with a bamboo cane. If you did things that were contrary to what the sage was teaching, you get beat with a bamboo cane. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, there was a lot of that apparently, and it was supposed to toughen you up. I'm sure they did it in the West too, with the pedagogues, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Amo amasa mat. Sada says. Okay, so anyway, let's move on then in this, because for the sake of time, because I do want to get to the whole Hindu thing. When he's talking about
Mm-hmm.
Oriental schools, he is talking about Chinese and Japanese schools, but those come later actually, because the Buddhist teachers came out of India, and the whole concept of schooling that he's getting at is an Indian school from the Indus
Mm-hmm.
Valley rather than necessarily Chinese. He says here that in the West, that is in Britain and America, and the French and Germans, the colonial government was a creation of the crown, and a fantastic idea began to circulate, which was a belief that people might create or destroy governments at their will. So he's being kind of flippant here, right? But this
Sure.
strange notion came out of, I don't know where it came out of, but suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, we can actually govern ourselves. That governments are instituted among men and they acquire their power by the consent of the governed. It's a radical idea.
Oh.
Now, what he doesn't go into is that this is actually a pretty old idea in the West. I mean, we can point back to like the Wat Tyler Rebellion there and say that there was an
Mm-hmm.
element of this in the Wat Tyler Rebellion, that when the peasants, if you will, rebelled against the king, they were rebelling primarily because he wasn't doing a good job, and they were sick of the way they were being managed, and so they rebelled against him, and they were ready to overthrow the government and institute their own government. Um, you could even say that to some degree that was something of the element of the War of the Roses that occurred, which is an
Oh, sure.
argument between the nobles of who was going to govern eventually. So
Mm.
I think it's an older idea than the 19th century or the 18th century, but it will go with what he says, right? It's a fantastic idea that came into America, especially, and all those uppity peasants.
Mm.
And so what does he says? He says, okay, um, the practical difficulties that these circumstances pose to utopian governing would have been insuperable except for one seemingly strange source of enthusiasm for such an endeavor in the business community. Okay. And I asked the question, what does he mean by utopian governing? What is that? And if we
Mm.
go back to this utopianism, basically, utopianism and autopianism are very closely related. Autopianism is governing with a perfect structure in order to make that ideal civilization. Utopian kind of has the hint that that whole business is not possible except for you have very tight control, very, very severe punishment for stepping out of line. So the difference between E versus EU. I mean, sorry, U versus EU.
Mhm.
Thomas More is playing off that in his great work. Because what Thomas More is saying is that the best of all governments, the freest and most thriving government, has very severe crackdowns on people and has very strange practices. And he's doing the same thing that Plato actually does in the Republic. Because at some point, Plato is constructing this beautiful city, this polis, but he's doing it as a metaphor to talk about the soul and what the structure of the soul is. So it's a parallel, it's an analog. And his interlocutors, the other people at the party there, they don't really get what he's saying. They think he's talking about actually overthrowing Athens and creating a whole new system. And so they ask him, because he has said something about a number governing all this. And they said, well, how would we do this? How do we create this great government? And if we did create this government, how come we see around us bad governments? Because it seems like an easy thing. And so Plato basically says, yeah, in order to do this, we have to rig a lottery. In order to get marriages to work, we have to have a draconian secret police that ferrets out everything. We have to govern the people like sheep, penning them up sometimes and letting them free other times. And we have to have a strict control over education. Everything, down to the last detail, must be controlled by the government, and then we'll have a free society.
Mhm.
So he's being tongue in cheek, and I think that the extension of that to Thomas More's utopia, and thus to what Gatto is saying here, is that there is a strong notion among our race, especially in the West, that we can achieve a perfect society. And that we achieve that perfect society where the best of the best rule us or govern us or guide us or whatever. And then everybody else kind of falls into place. But the only way we can do that is by having these very tight systems of thought. And no disruption to that system is
Mhm.
possible. I think that's what he's getting at. And how do you have a utopian government without having a fascist government or having
Mhm.
uh, a jailhouse, as he says it, a police state? How do you do that? And that's kind of what he's getting at here. He says that the puzzle can be solved by considering how the promise of democracy was a frightening terra incognita to men of substance. To look to men like Sam Adams or Thomas Paine as directors of the future was like looking down the barrel of a loaded gun, at least to people of means. So the men who begun the revolution were eased out by the men who ended it. Um, I read this to be that the people in power who have had the power and have been the leaders of society, the cream de la crop, um, they are normally the people who are also of great financial standing, great wealth. Not always the most noble, most virtuous, most talented. In fact, frequently not as generations go on.
Mhm.
But they are of great financial power, right? And as soon as you start saying everybody could govern, everybody can cook, as soon as you start saying everybody can govern, that is a terrible threat to those people that are in power.
Mhm.
Yeah. And Sam Adams and Thomas Paine are great examples of this. Sam Adams was a radical who was always agitating the crowds. He's the guy on the beer can, by the way, for those who are wondering. Um, he was the cousin of John Adams, who was the um, second, second president or third president, I forget. But anyway, and Thomas Paine. Have you read Thomas Paine at all?
A long time ago.
Okay,
A long
okay,
time ago. Yeah.
yeah. Thomas Paine he was a radical. There's no doubt about it, and he was a firebrand, and he sometimes overdid it in order to make his point. Down to the whole, I regret that I have but one life to give to my country, or whatever it was. I think that's Thomas
Mhm.
Paine, who he got hanged by the British. It's like, you could have diffused that situation and not ended up on the end of a rope there, Tom. But that was never his MO. Thomas Paine in the great work Common Sense, which is something that I really recommend to everybody. If not, you can get Common Sense online. That's a weird statement. You can get the book Common Sense online. It's a great book to read, and I highly recommend it. And it is a terrible challenge or threat to the monarchy, especially, and also to anybody who is financially in power. So that's why I recommend reading it. One of the major things that Payne says in there is that the only difference between kings and commoners is that kings are like thugs that are successful. They basically
Mm,
have beaten everybody else into submission. But otherwise, there's no difference. And that whole theory flies in the face of a fiction that had been created back during the 1300s, which was the divine right of kings theory. The divine right of kings was that the king was somebody who was anointed by God to rule, and he was like God's emissary on earth. And to some extent, that could be pushed back even to 800 with the crowning of Charlemagne there in Christmas. But it really
mm,
took off in the 1300s. The king, whether he was the king of Germany or France or England, was different from the commoner in that the king was anointed by God on earth to rule. And you don't mess with God's rule because that would send you straight to perdition. Included in that were all of his nephews and cousins and sisters and aunts. They were all part of God's holy elite and untouchable by other people. Um, and if, for instance, another person rose to power to challenge the king, he also had to have royal blood in him because otherwise he wasn't fit to rule. Which
mm,
is why, like in the Hundred Years' War and in the War of the Roses, the challengers to the throne were almost always other royals within the family line. They had to make a claim that they were royal. And then when you had a Welsh guy claiming that, it was like, a Welsh guy? Come on. But he succeeded, and became the next King of England. But the point was that was a long-standing thing from 1300. And so by the time we get to the 1700s, 400 years of saying the king is the untouchable ruler of England or France or whatever. And all of a sudden, you had this notion by Thomas Paine and others that no, he's just another guy. He puts his pants on one leg at a time. He's just like anybody else. He's just a guy. And that was outrageous. Not just because it precipitated the possibility of the king falling, but it precipitated the possibility of his sisters and cousins and aunts and nephews and all the other royals falling as well. And with them, all of the wealthy people as well would be touchable, so to speak. And they were very much touched by Madame Guillotine in the French Revolution. And a lot of that is because of Thomas Paine. So
mm,
that bloodbath of the French Revolution was due to this idea that, yes, he is touchable, go touch him.
mm, mm.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to kind of round out this session today because it begins to poke holes in this idea that education is in order to make that elite class. Thomas Paine was a real threat to that notion. And
Mm.
that's why, again, people who are interested in education should read Thomas Paine. If the program is there in order to make the elite class, then it needs to be dismantled because the elite class is they're people, they're humans, just like everybody else. And if you disagree, put it in the comments. Fight me. Okay, so sorry to have gone on. I just thought this is a fun subject to tackle.
It is, and it's important, especially when we're discussing our current system and
Yes.
why it is the way that it is.
Yeah, because one could ask the question, have we moved away from this idea of the elites, or are we becoming more elite in our current era?
Mm. Yeah.
One wonders, tech bros. One wonders. Well, I'm going to end it now. I claiming to have a tea date, so I have to go and tea somewhere. And thank you very much. It's been a very good chance to connect over this, and hopefully we'll be able to do that as the school year begins. And anybody who is watching or who is following this, if you had questions or had things to point out, please feel free to put them in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, Jen, thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.